Good evening, everyone. If I can't be heard, yell. I'm Allan Chapin. I'm the chairman of the French American Foundation in the United States. I want to thank you all for coming this evening. It's a very important event for us. We are honoring several journalists for their outstanding work in addressing issues pertaining to immigration and integration. A few words about us for those of you who don't know who we are. Sorry, Linda, not loud enough? Right. French American Foundation, we like to say, is the principal non-governmental organization that brings together leaders from France and the United States to address a wide array of social and economic policy-related matters. Since our founding in 1976, whoa, now we have a speaker. We have our 40th anniversary next May, and we hope you will all come to our outstanding gala that we're putting together. Some of our earliest programs were exchanges between journalists and media professionals. Jim Lowenstein, who is not here tonight, but one of our founders, said, we decided we'd just bring some French journalists over here and put them in families in Iowa and whatever, so they could figure out what the United States was about. Apparently this was a great success, but we've been continuing this now for almost 4 decades. In 2011, we started to try to marry this tradition with a focus on social issues: immigration, quality of education, health care, just to name a few. And since 2011, we have been supporting independent and responsible reporting on immigration and integration, trying to promote excellence in journalism, and we have created this award, an Immigration Journalism Fellowship Award. I have to say, when you read some of the stories that we've had over the past, it is shocking and disheartening what our immigration policy is. I was talking to our friends from TF1 saying, in addition to journalism, we need a few photographs of what's really going on, because it is disheartening in the extreme. In the last 4 years, we've provided Immigration Journalism Fellowship resources to more than 25 journalists to pursue projects exploring diverse questions pertaining to immigration. They've spanned the whole globe, and I think they really have had an impact on how we view immigration and its impact on society as a whole. It's a little incredible to read about the presidential debate. I've stopped watching them on TV, but the idea that everyone has forgotten that this whole country is immigrants is ridiculous. The reason we're here tonight is to honor the 4th class of winners of the Immigration Journalism Award: François Dufour of Playback Press and Maria Sacchetti of the Boston Globe. We received a wealth of high-quality journalism and had more than 75 applications for this prize. Since we couldn't decide, we also awarded honorable mention to 2 other projects: Bob Ortega and Daniel Gonzalez of the Arizona Republic, and Rachel Nolan's piece in Harper's Magazine. We are delighted that Rachel flew in from Guatemala, where she's a Fulbright scholar, to be with us this evening. Thank you.
Thank you for doing this. You're so glad to do it.
I must recognize the donors whose contributions have made this program possible. I met Antoine Guello and Samira Dujadi from TF1 and La Fondation TF1 in Paris not so very long ago, probably it was months. We also have support from the Carnegie Foundation of New York and Air France. This has helped us continue this work. We're rewarding excellence in media coverage of immigration. Before we get to the awards, however, We are joined by Philippe Bolopion, who's the United Nations Director at Human Rights Watch, who will be sharing with us keynote remarks on the human rights implications of immigration, notably as Europe sees historic influxes of refugees and migrants because of the Syrian conflict. Philippe Bolopion, I understand, has been the United Nations Director at Human Rights Watch since August 2010. Prior to that, he spent 5 years as UN correspondent at Le Monde, where he covered a wide range of UN issues and traveled to such places as Darfur, Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo, I don't envy you that, Sri Lanka, Gaza, and Haiti, including on missions with UN Secretary Generals and the UN Security Council. He's also covered the United Nations for France 24 and Radio France Internationale. Prior to his work covering the United Nations, he covered the Kosovo conflict in 1999 and 2000. Like all geniuses, he's a graduate of the Institut d'études politiques and a journalism school at Strasbourg. With that, I will turn it over to you, and probably take off for France.
All right, very good.
Thank you.
All right, thank you very much for inviting me to make this presentation. As a former journalist myself, I really have deep appreciation for the kind of in-depth work and innovative work that's being celebrated today. And of course, the theme is very relevant to the work we do at Human Rights Watch, and it comes at a time where, as many of you know, we face a real refugee crisis around the world. In fact, it's a really unprecedented crisis. According to the Office of the UN Agency for Refugees, today there are something like 60 million people around the world who have fled their homes because of war or because of persecution. And this is almost twice as much as what we had 10 years ago. So it's a growing crisis. In fact, 60 million people, if it was the population of a country, would be the 24th biggest country in the world, just to give you an idea of the magnitude of the challenge. And when you know that half of these refugees are in fact children, I think you get a sense for the urgency. And the reality is that the UN system and the humanitarian community in general is simply overwhelmed by this crisis. There was a quote from Antonio Guterres, who is the head of the UN refugee agencies, a few months ago, and he said that, and I'm quoting him, humanitarian organizations are no longer able to clean up the mess. And that's striking. I think it's true, the UN is short on money for any of these crises. So why are we facing such a crisis in the first place? Why is it so bad right now? I think one of the reasons is that we know what pushes people to leave their homes, to be displaced. It's human rights violations, it's war, it's violence, it's abuses, it's persecutions. And sadly, over the last couple of years, we've seen a multiplication of crises around the world. I can run quickly through a few of them, but you're very familiar with them. There is, of course, the war in Syria, which has claimed 220,000 lives so far, with no end in sight. There is the conflict in South Sudan, where tens of thousands of people have been killed along ethnic lines over the last couple of years. There is the situation in Darfur, which is not in the news anymore, but where Sudanese forces continue to commit mass rape and to kill and loot villages. There is the situation in Iraq, where ISIS is engaging in organized rape and sexual slavery. There is the situation in Burma, where ethnic Muslim Rohingyas are being discriminated against and fleeing in large numbers on boats to other countries. It's the other refugee crisis that's not getting nearly the attention that Europe is getting, but the situation there is just as bad. There is Libya, where the country is in complete lawlessness. I'm back from Burundi, where I was a couple of weeks ago, where there's been a wave of killings, very threatening speeches by government officials, some reminiscent of what was said during the genocide in Rwanda, and just in Burundi over the last couple of months, 200,000 people have fled to neighboring countries. There is Afghanistan and Somalia, where for decades now there has been conflict, and whose refugees are living in a sort of limbo situation with no chance at a future. And very sadly, the list goes on and on and on. And so often there is almost a tendency to give up or to disengage from this crisis, the feeling that Western countries, Western powers cannot cope with this crisis and cannot solve all these problems. But when that happens, we see that these problems have other ways of manifesting themselves, and we see now at the doorsteps of Europe the very people that have been pushed out of their homes by these crises. In fact, the majority of people arriving in Europe right now are coming from Syria, from Afghanistan, from Iraq, from Somalia, and Eritrea. So I would say that there is no question that we are being tested as an international community by this crisis. When you look around, I would argue that we are failing that test so far. How is the world dealing with this massive influx of refugees? Well, for one thing, in many places, people are building walls and fences, which is the sort of most primitive way of trying to control refugee flows, which of course doesn't take into account the challenges of people arriving in these places and whether or not they are fleeing life-threatening conditions, for example. So a few examples: Israel built a fence on the Sinai border in 2012 to try to keep away Eritreans and Sudanese mostly. Bulgaria built a fence in late 2013 to keep away mostly refugees coming from Syria. The US, of course, has fences across the border with Mexico, where the US officials have pushed back asylum seekers or thrown them into detention facilities. Or sometimes they are being deported to places where their lives are at risk. In fact, today there are something like 400,000 people who are held in immigration detention centers in the US, which is the fastest growing system of incarceration in the US, which I think is very, very telling. Another temptation to deal with this flow of refugees is sometimes to outsource the migration controls. So for a long time, European policymakers have tried to outsource this problem, and right now, for example, they are trying to reward Turkey for keeping away from Europe some of the Syrian refugees that are coming on our shores. Some other EU governments are also trying to convince African countries to do more to prevent people from accessing Europe. Australia is very well known for a policy of intercepting boats full of migrants in the high seas and pushing them back, sometimes to offshore detention centers. And of course, all these measures have a very simple, clear goal, which is trying to keep people away from these countries. It's often couched in a sort of humanitarian language, which you hear a lot with the refugee crisis in Europe these days. You know, governments will say that these measures are intended to prevent people from risking their lives on small boats that are unsafe, or they are going to make the debate about preventing smugglers from abusing the rights of migrants, even though they know that in many cases when people are being denied any safe routes and legal routes to go to Europe or to the US or to other places, they have no choice but to turn to smuggling networks. I think in this debate there is also a tendency to lose sight of the big picture of the refugee crisis. So the reality is that most of the world's refugees right now are in southern countries, in the global south. And yet, I think for many of us, the crisis has become very real once we started seeing images of migrants in Europe being stranded in train stations, stuck in muddy fields, the freezing rains, or people being tear gassed, things like that, or even worse, images like the Syrian boy, Allan, and I'm sure all of you remember these very strong images of this dead boy on washing a shore. And so it was, I think, these images have shocked the conscience of many of us. The reality is that since this boy died, dozens more have been drowning on the doorsteps of Europe. So one of the questions is, how do we turn the tide, and how do we try to encourage more rights-respecting policies? For one, one of the things that we are trying to do, and I think some of the journalists being celebrated here are trying to do, is that we try to tell the stories of these people, explain who these people are, what are they fleeing, why are they risking their lives on these boats. We try to put a sort of human face on this story in the hope that governments and public opinions will be moved to deal with the problem in a more rights-respecting way. Of course, Human Rights Watch is not an organization that advocates for a sort of open border policy. We are not naive. We know that Western countries cannot accept every single person that's trying to go into their countries. But we try to make sure that these countries at least do what human rights law requires, which is fair treatment at the border. We are trying to push for expanded search and rescue operations, stepped up humanitarian efforts. Right now, even in Europe, often it's volunteers who are helping these people who arrive instead of being government agencies or UN agencies. We are trying to push for more safe and legal channels to enter these countries, so people do not have to risk their lives doing it. And we are also pushing for a better European asylum system, because we believe the system is broken right now. I would say that sadly there are signs that Europe's heart is hardening in a way. Even some of the most progressive countries like Sweden or like Germany are showing signs that they cannot cope or do not want to cope with the problem anymore. And I think if we are fair, we have to admit that the numbers are not unmanageable. Just to give you some perspective, this year there is something like 800,000 asylum seekers who have tried to arrive to Europe through sea. And if you compare that with the flow of refugees that just the neighboring countries of Syria are dealing with, Jordan, Lebanon, Turkey, they have dealt with close to 4 million refugees. And of course these countries are not nearly as well equipped as European countries are to deal with that. So what we see in Europe right now is a failure to manage the situation, which is often made worse by the fear-mongering of some politicians, as well as sometimes some journalism that's very sensationalist. That's really the polar opposite of the kind of journalism that we celebrate today. At the same time, all of this being said, there are also reasons to hope. We have seen often in Europe that people have responded to the crisis with much more respect and dignity than many of their governments. So despite all the stories of government inactions, we've seen people all over Europe showing a sort of outpouring of compassion for ordinary citizens, children, doctors, lifeguards, train conductors, soccer fans. Many people have rallied all over Europe to help refugees and migrants. Often I would say that these people are moved to do these things by the kind of journalism that we are again celebrating today. When we are able to tell the story in an accurate way, in a fair way, respecting the dignity of the people we are talking about, I think we can make a real difference. Right now, whether it's in the US or in Europe, we think that there is a real need to treat people who have legitimate claims for asylum in a much more dignified way. And doing anything short of that really would be making a mockery of countries like the US or in Europe that have been built on the respect of human rights. Thank you.